Hi. Hey, Dad.
Hey, how are you?
Hi, Robert. Hey,
Hi.
Jacob.
Hey,
All right. I think in my email today I forgot to include the link to the source sheet, so I apologize for everyone who likes to have it in advance. But let me give it to you now. And
in your water?
And let's get started. So as we mentioned in the email today, we dedicate the shir for Shleima for Joshua, Simcha ben Chana Devora. We hope that doctors soon figure out what's going on and that he has a full recovery for Shleima.
Thank you. Me.
I want to say that he rejoins us in the shir, but if he's fully recovered, he'll be going to singing every Tuesday night. So he'll join us in the recording in this year. So anyway, the parsha this week is Matot-Masei, and with it we conclude Sefer Bamidbar. Let me just pull up the source sheet. I have to open the source sheet before I can share it. There we go. Okay. And the parsha opens. It's a very interesting opening with laws of Nadarum, of vows, and it's familiar to us, I think, really only because of our practice on Rosh, the high holidays, leading up to the high holidays, where we do Hatarat Nadarim every year. There are other occasions during the year when people might make Hatarat Nadarim, which is a nullification of vows. But we do it as kind of a formality leading up to Rosh Hashanah, or as part of our tshuva process for the Yamim Norim for the high holidays. And Kol Nidre is a fascinating prayer for many reasons, but it's a very complicated history about whether it should be said, should not be said. There are many very strong, much strong opposition to Kol Nidre. The Kol Nidre is a form of Hatarat Nidarim, of nullification of vows. Part of the question is it meant to be a nullification of the previous year's vows or of the coming year's vows, right? We, from the get-go, say that we undo or any vows that we make won't be binding. So there's a fascinating history about Kol Nidre. Maybe one year we'll delve into that a little bit more. But the source of all this really is our parsha, the opening of our parsha. So we're in Bamidbar chapter 30. Vayidaber Moshe Roshei Hamatot. I'm getting an echo from somebody, so I'm going to. If you're not muted, if you could please mute yourselves. Thank you. Vayidaber Moshe Roshei Hamatot Livnei Yisrael Lemor Zeh Hadavar Asher Tzivah Hashem. Moshe speaks to the head of the tribes of Bnei Yisrael, saying this is what God has commanded. Ish ki yidor neder la Hashem, o hi shavash shvu'ah le'esor isar al nafsho, lo yachel dvaro kechol yotzei mipiv yaseh. If a man makes a vow to God, or swears an oath to forbid something to himself, he must follow. He can't disobey that vow. He has to follow that vow, and whatever comes out of his mouth. Isha ki tidor neder la Hashem v'asra isar b'veit aviha b'nureha. And if a woman makes a vow to God and forbids something to herself while she is living in her father's home as a na'ara, in her youth, as an adolescent. And her father hears of the vow that she made, and he's quiet. So then this vow is valid, and she's forbidden to do whatever she said she was forbidden to do. But if her father denies her when he hears of the vow that she made, then it's not valid, and Hashem will forgive her, because her father forbade it. And if she's married and she has a vow, Shama isha b'yom shamo v'charish la v'kamu kol nedareha, and if her husband hears of the vow and he's silent, then it is valid. She's forbidden to do whatever she said. V'im b'yom shamoa isha yani ota ve'fir et nidra asher aleha ve'mitzah sfateha asher asra nafsha Hashem yislachla, and if her husband, on the day that he hears it, denies it, then it's not valid. It's not binding on her. And Hashem will forgive her. So we have this interesting way of introducing the concept of Hatarat Nadarim, of nullifying vows, which is by the mechanism of a woman who is, right, it's not a politically correct way of saying it because it was not a politically correct society, but a woman who's under the control of someone else, right? So either a woman who is living in her father's home and therefore, quote, under control of her father, or who is married and, quote, under control of her husband. So then she's not totally at will to make her own vows. The control, again, it's not the right term, but you know what I mean when I say the controlling party has some control over the efficacy of the vows that she makes. This is the subject of many, many pages of Talmud in the tractate Nadarum, Masechet Nadarum. Right, they also get into the distinction between a neder and a shvua. Right, if you remember when we do a Hatarat Nadarim before Yom Kippur, so we say kol neder, kol shvua, kol cherem, right, or konam, all different types of ways in which someone may commit themselves to something or forbid something upon themselves, whether it's a vow, an oath, other phrases that are used. So there's a lot of discussion about what is the difference. If you've already made one vow, can another vow be made? If you've made an oath, can another oath be made? A lot of really interesting conceptual topics that are raised around the subject of vows. But I wanted to focus tonight really on a kind of shocking comment of the Ramban. Before we get to the Ramban, I think that the question is more sharply brought up by the Rashbam, the grandson of Rashi. And he says that when he was, I'm not sure what this city is, and I don't know what the translation has. Nishalti Yoniyuv, which is Shem-Ir, the name of a city, Bikrach Lushron, in the region of Lushron, which is, I think that region we still call a region in France by that name, but maybe not, I'm not sure. Anyway, he's asked by people of some city, some town in France, the following question. Lefi hapshat, hichan matzinu shum parsha shematchelet kain. There's no other portion in the Torah that begins in this format. Shelo ne'emar lemala vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor ish kidor neder. Right? We would have expected to be introduced with the phrase, Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, right? And then give us the law of vows, that if a man makes a vow, then it's binding, and about a woman, etc. But our parsha opens with Moshe saying these laws without any indication that it's coming, he's transmitting it from God, right? We'll go back to the pasuk. Moshe speaks to the heads of the tribes of Israel, saying, this is what God commanded. But God doesn't tell Moshe to tell them this. That's the question that these people in France have. Okay, everyone got the question? It doesn't fit the normal format. So now we can go to the Ramban, number 3. V'ta'am, v'yidaber Moshe Roshei HaMatot, ki ein tzorech lelamed l'chol b'nei Israel. So the Ramban is asking the same question, right? Why does the Torah introduce this with just saying Moshe instructed it to the heads of the tribes without a formal introduction or without giving it to the entire nation as we would have expected? Ki ein tzorech lelamed l'chol b'nei Israel. Sha'av v'habal yecholim lahafer nidrei inui nefesh. Says there's no need to teach the entire nation that a father or a husband has the right to deny or to invalidate the vow of a daughter or of a wife. Ulai tzarich laha'alim ela hachukim mehem. And maybe we should hide these laws from the nation. Shelo yinhagu kalut rosh b'nedarim, because they might take the whole concept of vows lightly. It's a joke. What you mean? You're going to make a vow and I'll forgive the vow, right? It's something, or maybe they'll just laugh at the concept. Why in this situation can it be nullified, in this situation it can't be? It's going to lead to them degrading or treating lightly the concept of Nadarum. So he says maybe it's better to leave this, to let this be hidden from the entire nation. Aval l'chachmei Yisrael v'shei shivteihem limed hamishpat. But he had to teach it to the leaders, right? Moshe is not going to take them into the land of Israel. This has to be transmitted to the next generation somehow. People in charge have to know that this is a rule in the books, so we'll just tell it to the leaders and keep it very hush-hush. And then the Ramban continues a few lines down. We'll just read the English here. The reason for this law being indicated in the manner of allusion is, as I have said above, that Scripture treated absolution from a vow or oath as if it were one of the secrets of the Torah, which are only to be revealed to those who are fit to hear them, and therefore they are written in the Torah in allusion. Okay, so the Ramban says it really is better off that the people not know about this. Right? As with last week, we could raise the question, well, if that's the case, why is it recorded in the Torah, right? Why didn't it remain something in only the oral tradition, right? So it might have worked for the first generation that they weren't aware of it or wasn't publicized, but once the Torah is written down, it's accessible to everyone, and we now all know about the vows. The Ramban says that it's best be hidden. It's best not be shared with the entire nation. It's not for public consumption, which is a fascinating idea that the Ramban has. And so I wanted to, kind of jumping off from the Ramban, think out loud with you and look at some sources, some which I imagine might be familiar, some maybe not as familiar, about the idea of transparency. And we hear a lot about transparency in our modern society, right? Every time there's an election cycle, one of the biggest running points from both parties is the need for more transparency in Washington, right? We have the same thing in Israel. I imagine every other country. I don't follow politics of other countries as much. But I imagine like this is a big issue whenever there's a government, whenever there's someone in charge, is that one of the most common complaints that there's not enough transparency. And so the question is transparency of value in Judaism? Is it a value in Halacha? Any initial thoughts or reactions to what we've seen so far? It's a shocking Ramban.
Among Jews, unlike among Christians at the same time, everybody was literate.
Right.
And it was, well, anyway, everybody, and at the same time, just about the same time when people were being burned at the stake for wanting to publish the testaments in the Vulgate in language that people could understand, just about the same time that Senorena came out, right? About a little later, which made Torah more accessible to people who didn't understand Lashon HaKodesh, who weren't.
Right. And I mean, the Senorena is rather late if we're talking about,
yeah, it's a couple hundred years later, but still that idea was pretty common, that no, this isn't for everybody, this is just for the clergy, and we'll tell you what we want you to know, kind of thing.
The Bibles in Christian churches and Catholic churches were generally chained to the reading table. And the only one in the community typically who could read, maybe, was the priest.
Right.
And so an alternative religion ends up being spread, so the folk religion, which includes all kinds of things that are not in the Christian Bible or in their translation of the Hebrew Bible. And there was no way for anyone to contradict until Martin Luther comes along and says, I looked at it, I checked it, I translated it, here it is.
Right.
And you can't trust the Pope, you can't trust the priest. They're
Right.
lying,
Right.
they're hiding. That's remarkable as to having hidden wisdom or secrets that you're uncomfortable with.
Well, there is Kabbalah. That's not for everybody.
Right, right. So, right, I mean, so let's take a step back, because what Robert and Rena are talking about certainly is very valid, and we often, think, contrast Judaism to Christianity. Right, even before that, right, many feel, right, we're done with Sefer Vayikra, but I know I'm still in the Daf Yomi Parsha. I'm not quite on the up to date with it, but the Daf Yomi is studying Masechet Yoma, which is all about the ceremony, the celebration of Yom Kippur, and all the different things that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, went through, right? And so, on the one hand, many say, well, there was this thing that only the Kohen Gadol could do, and talk about a hierarchy. That's the biggest hierarchy there is. At the same time, though, the details of what he went through were spelled out step by step, so that everyone knew, or everyone had the potential to know what was going on. The Torah, right? We're in Sefer Bamidbar, which for me is a much more interesting, engaging text than Sefer Vayikra. Sefer Vayikra, which deals with all the sacrifices, is very challenging, but it's also, broad picture, it's amazing that all these details about what goes on in the Mishkan and how the sacrifices work and what was done, right, is an extreme opposite of all other religions that existed at the time, where it was only the priests that knew and that had access, and everything was a big cloud of mystery. So, many would say that the Torah from its inception is not only advocating and sharing transparently what happens, but that many say that this is actually a great polemic against other religions of the time. That the fact that the Torah shares in such detail, even if it limits who has access and who can do specific things, but the very idea of the fact that these rituals and ceremonies were shared, were made known to everyone else, is quite radical, and that's one of the amazing features of the Torah. So we could say that in itself is a great case to be made, and we will say that is a great case that the Torah cares about transparency and about everyone having full knowledge of what's happening, even if not everyone has full access to every piece, every step of the ceremonies being described. Everyone at least has knowledge and familiarity with it. Any other thoughts at the get-go?
Oh, the Rashi points out that the princes are addressed because they may potentially be the ones who would release a vow.
Right.
And so the reason that, it's a way of protecting the whole system, because if, I don't know if at that time they could have 3 learned people getting together to release a vow yet or not, but that someone else would
Right.
have.
Right. So the halacha that Anne's referring to is that we always convene a beit din, right, a tribunal of 3 when we do Hatarat Nadarum. But the halacha is that it can be either a beit din of, quote, regular people, or it could be one mumche, one expert, one sage, to release the vows. And so maybe Rashi and others say that Moshe shared it specifically with the leaders because they had the capacity to release the vows on their own without needing a court of 3.
Well, I found that the frequent resort to something that Moses was told on Sinai to be a little disingenuous and I don't have enough faith to totally believe it literally.
Uh-huh.
To me, it seems like when you make something, when something is established without an excuse, that's a good way to give it legitimacy.
Okay. So this gets into a big question that's been raised in more modern times with the whole question of biblical criticism and how we know the Torah is true.
No, not the Torah is true, but Jewish practice is true.
Uh-huh.
Relating to things that are not explicit in the Torah.
Okay. So the Torah, the oral law.
But the
But
power of, excuse me,
Sir.
sorry. The power that we have to sanctify, any Jew can take something and in a sense sanctify it, by using the proper intention, the proper brachos. What does that mean? I mean, that's a tremendous power, and it is something that is available to every Jew, but it's particularly important when it comes to sacrifices, because
Right.
if it isn't spoken by the person that this dear animal is going to be sacrificed in place of the person or whatever they're thinking about it, if it's to give thanks, to provide food for people, whatever it is, but they could have all these different reasons for doing it. But if they don't say that this is what it is, that this is devoted, it isn't devoted. And if they do say it, it is devoted.
Right.
So that's a tremendous power. So, and as the Chafetz Chaim spent most of his life proving, we have the power to give life and to kill each other with our words. So to protect the word is very important. And I see the level of the princes doing that in situations where somebody within a given tribe, that he knows the different families, he'll know the tendency of the people, and he would have the authority to help to release someone, and would know enough of their own life circumstances to know, ask the right questions.
Right.
Well, you had known such and such, such and such. So it's a way of establishing a tribe, but cutting down on the tribal rivalries. So
Okay.
Uh,
I thought that was very interesting.
Okay. Robert, you want to say something else?
I'm just wrestling with it. The issue of do you say what you mean, or do you mean what you say? When a vow is voiced,
Yes. Good question.
is it an authentic statement? Which I think that Mrs. Solomon is pointing at as well. It's tremendously important to be transparent in regard to what you mean and what you would intend. And if you, I have an issue at this point that's very strange. It's specific to Brooklyn College and the City University of New York. I stated my full intention to resign from the union of the faculty because the faculty union at the City University adopted an anti-Israel, essentially anti-Semitic resolution by one section of the leadership. I have colleagues who went ahead with this. I have a problem. I have an issue with regard to insurance that I lose a certain particular benefit that can be significant. And I had to go check, do I have to stay in the union, not stay in the union? And I've had to back off because there's a material, very specific reason if I leave the union, but I've got colleagues who I support who have walked away from it.
Right. Yeah, and that certainly is, it's both a local issue, in Masechet Nadarum, the whole notion of intention and, unintended consequences of a vow as being a way to be matir, to nullify it, is discussed at length. And I think you're right. I think that also, that's true locally, and it's true more broadly when we think in broad strokes about this idea of transparency. Both as far as what information we share, but also about the consequences of that information.
Well, reading through the Talmud, unless the Talmud was getting fanciful when it talks about vows, people must have lived in very testy times when husbands and wives were constantly making vows not to benefit from each other and the like. There's something like as bad as we have, as some marriages are here, I've never seen the like of it. And it doesn't feel like they're making it up. Like in Europe, we hear about 7 brides or 7 brother cases, which seem to be sort of a thought exercise, which I probably did not come up very often. But
Yeah,
but if you read through this, it really felt like a lot of marriages and a lot of people were really at loggerheads. The times must have been very difficult
right.
in order to keep an emotional equilibrium.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Gary. About I think you're right. Reading the Talmud about Nadarum, it does make you wonder what people's relationships were like. Some of the examples of vows that people would make are quite striking and really don't sit well at all with us. And I don't know. I don't know if these are theoretical examples or if these were common vows that were made.
They don't seem systematic the way Yubam does when you read through it. So I have a feeling that things are so testy that the rabbis had to make a way of annulling vows in order to keep bloodshed to a minimum.
Interesting theory. All right, let's get let's get a little bit broader here. Okay, so now we're going to talk more broad strokes about the idea of transparency. We're going to start with source number 4. This happens every time. I know people print out the source sheet, so I try to minimize space, but now I can't get the Hebrew and the English to go on the screen at the same time. So I promise I'll show the English in a second. Very provocative Gemara from Menachot. Gemara is talking about the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, the mitzvah of studying Torah, and whether there are any minimal requirements to that. Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Afilu lo kara adam ela kriyat shma shacharit ba'arvit, kiyem lo yamush. If a person, all the Torah they learn an entire day is saying Shema in the morning and Shema in the evening, quite a low level of Torah, right? They're not even saying the rest of doctrine. All they're saying is Shema, right? And that's all they say all day long. They have fulfilled the requirements of learning Torah every day. But this is forbidden to teach to the masses. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. And just parenthetically, remember who Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai is. Remember the story of the cave and what happens when he emerges from the cave? He sets the world on fire because he can't bear to stand people not learning Torah all the time. So this isn't reflective of that attitude. Okay, but asur la'omo b'fnei amei haaretz, you're not allowed to share this halachic requirement with the masses. Rava Amar, mitzvah la'omo b'fnei amei haaretz. Not only are we allowed to teach it to the masses, it's a mitzvah to teach it to the masses. Lest we begin or use this as a means of instilling the very familiar notion of Jewish guilt, right? In a familiar category of how much Torah have you learned. He says, no, it's a mitzvah. People shouldn't be coerced or tricked into learning more Torah than is halachically mandated, right? Or they shouldn't feel bad about themselves if all they're able to do in the course of their day is to say Shema. They fulfilled the mitzvah. I'm sure Rav would prefer that people learn more than just Kriyat Shema every day, but he is very much in our discussion on the transparency side of things, that this is something that should be shared and publicized widely, because that's what the halacha is. And if that's what the halacha is, then who are we to create an illusion that it's not such? So I'll give you a second to look at the English for this source, ask if there are any reactions or thoughts about it before we move on. So the next source is really one that is the best summary I could find of a larger discussion. But, and I'll just summarize what's going on here. We're all familiar with the notion of chumrah, of stringency, and of minhag, of custom. And oftentimes people have a minhag to be machmir about something. So the Shach, who's one of the significant commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, says that when it comes to minhag in chumrah, you have to be aware that what you're doing is a chumrah or a minhag and is not the baseline halachic requirements. And this is relevant when it comes to our topic of hatarat nadarim. Right? Let's say someone has the practice of always waiting, Rabbeinu Tam, right? Waiting 72 hours after sunset before they end Shabbos. And they're now in a shul that ends Shabbos, doesn't hold like Rabbeinu Tam, but ends Shabbos after 50 minutes or 48 minutes, whatever we calculated. Can they adopt the custom of their new community, or do they have to keep their former chumrah? So he makes the distinction and says, well, if you do it with an awareness that what you were doing was a chumrah, so then you can switch. If you, right, you need to have an awareness of when you're doing something as a chumrah, as a stringency, eating, right, only eating chalav Yisrael cheese, milk, right? So that's a chumrah. What do you do if you're in a situation where there is no chalav Yisrael certified cheese available? Do you not eat any dairy for that period of time? No. So then if it's a chumrah, you can say, I can't fulfill that chumrah in these circumstances, so I can go to a more baseline halachic requirement. So that's the distinction that the Shach is making there. But again, as far as the idea of transparency, he's very much advocating that you have to have a complete awareness of why you do what you do. Do you do something because it is the halachic requirements, or do you do something because it is a chumrah or a minhag that your community, your family adopted, but to have that awareness that it is not the baseline halachic requirement. That's the point of that shach. Another really interesting area where this idea comes up is appears a few times in the Talmud. We'll see two examples of this. So the discussion point is the Mishnah in Beitza. Masechet Beitza deals primarily with laws of Yom Tov. So the Mishnah tells us, Kol shechayavim alav mishum shfut, mishum reshut, mishum mitzvah b'Shabbat, chayavim alav b'Yom Tov. So anything which on Shabbat is forbidden either because of shvut, of you're not allowed to do something, you passively can't use it. Reshut, it's something that you're not allowed to do, or it's a mitzvah that you have to do on Shabbos. So the same rules generally apply on Yom Tov, right? We know that there's the exceptions to Yom Tov are ochel nefesh. But generally, whatever is forbidden on Shabbat is forbidden on Yom Tov. Elohin mishum shvut. What is an example of something that is forbidden because of shvut, because of rest or passively not doing something? Lo olin be'ilan, v'lo rochvin al gabe behema, v'lo shatin al pnei hamayim. You cannot climb a tree, you cannot ride on an animal, you cannot swim. Why can't we do those things? It's not all the same reason. But why can't we climb a tree? We're concerned you might
themselves in danger.
Oh, it's a danger. It's dangerous, but specifically on Shabbos, right? It's not saying that it's forbidden all the time. It's saying specifically on Shabbos and Yom Tov.
We're interfering with the creation.
Okay. Okay. So
Could break a branch off?
yeah, that's
Right,
the more
yeah.
technical concern, that you might break a branch. Why can't you ride an animal?
Tchum Shabbos? I don't know.
Okay, so there are discussions of tchum, about going beyond the boundary that you're allowed to travel on Shabbos. There is
Because you have to pat the animal, or?
we have to give the animals rest, but here also it's a concern primarily that you might break off a twig or something to use as a prod for the animal. So it's a muksa issue. We're concerned of what you might do, and why can't we swim? This is for many the most troubling, especially in Baltimore in the summer, if there's a pool next door that you could otherwise swim in. The Gemara says that you're concerned a person might build a raft if they're swimming. They might build a raft in the river. It seems very far-fetched. There's also discussion that we're concerned that maybe you'll drip when you emerge from the water. You might drip onto the grass and cause it to
Would one be allowed to inflate by blowing into a valve of a tube
or a raft?
Yeah, so that
or a raft or whatever?
The concern with the raft is tying, specifically kosher, tying permanent knots. Tubes and tube inflatables might be problematic because of tikkun kli, because you're completing a tool or an instrument. So there's lots of discussion about all these things. But then we get to 3 more things. Lo mitapchin, v'lo misapkin, v'lo mirakti. You can't clap your hands, you can't clap on your thighs, and you cannot dance. Why are those activities forbidden?
No idea.
The concern is that those are seen as musical expressions, and if we allow these musical expressions, it might lead to the conclusion that you can use musical instruments, and if you use musical instruments, your instrument might break and you might have to fix it.
Does that extend to not using a spoon to knock on the table, or
it might. There's a fascinating Tosfot on this Gemara. Right, let's see the Gemara, and then we'll see. Right, the Gemara itself is fascinating. The Tosfot says that's not a concern anymore because now we bring all of our instruments to professionals to fix. So the Tosfot say we can clap on Shabbos, we can bang on the table, and that's okay. So
as far as riding a horse, you know Rabbi Shapiro's story?
Nope.
What's his first name? Rabbi Shapiro.
Chaim.
Chaim Shapiro. Yeah, he was in, where was he, in Russia? That's how he escaped the Nazis. Anyway, he convinced some loggers or something that they would they would give him, what would they do? Something, so he would give them, I don't know, he paid them off with schnapps. And he delivered it on Shabbos on a horse. And then the publisher of the book, it's a wonderful book. And the publisher told him, or somebody in there said, you can't do that. You can't write. And he explained why he could and why. Okay.
Interesting. So let's see what the Gemara says about this. Amarle Rava Barav Chanin LeRabi Labaye. Tnan ein mitavchin ve'misavkin ve'meraktin va'ina dekachazina de'avdan hachi v'aminan lehu midi. Right? So he quotes our Mishnah that says you're not allowed to clap your hands or your thighs or to dance. We see that nowadays people do this all the time and no one stops them. Amarle Ubatame Chada Amar Lo Leitev Inisha Puma Delichia Dilma Mingadar Le Chefetz Va'atela Tuye Arba Armokeshut Aravim. Says, well, if you're right, well, there's another case where we should also protest against what people do, which is that the Halacha says elsewhere you're not supposed to sit right at the boundary of the Eruv, or of a Mavui, right, of a courtyard leading from a public domain to private domain. You see that lots of people sit right at the edge of the Eruv, and no one stops them. So how are both cases justifiable that we don't protest? Ella hanach lahem liYisrael mutavshu shogegin va'al yehu mizidi. So there we say that the reason we don't protest against people sitting by the edge of the Eruv is leave the Jewish people alone. It's better that they sin errantly and not sin intentionally. If we were to tell them, they would continue to do this practice, and then they would be amazing. Then they would be intentional sinners. So better that they remain unintentional or naive sinners. Hachanami, in our case too, them alone, it's better that they be unintentional sinners rather than intentional sinners. Okay, so it's better not to let people know what the halacha is, because if they're not going to follow it anyway, we'd rather that they have a lesser liability level.
So nowadays with Art Scroll and other sources and websites and so on,
Yeah.
to remain ignorant requires tremendous effort. And it just, what is it? There's a story about, I'm sorry, the Ohav Yisrael, I'm blanking on the Rav's name, very prominent in the 18th century, one of the early Hasidic greats. And he's walking on Shabbos and happens to see somebody smoking. He knew he was Jewish, and he went and said, they're Berdichever. And he sees somebody who is smoking, and he said, I know, you probably don't know it's Shabbos. And the guy says, yes, I do know. Then you probably don't know that it's not permitted to light a flame on Shabbos. I do know. And you're not aware that it's really not permitted. And this, no, I know it. And he goes and he quotes from the passages in the Torah from this. And the Berdichever supposedly looks up towards the sky and says, Rabboni Shalom, look at what honest people your B'nai Yisrael are.
Yeah, it's a great story. Yeah, it's true that it's, I mean, it's even with Art Scroll and all the other English guidebooks and websites, still say 85 to 90% of the Jewish people nowadays does remain ignorant of many of these basic halachot. And, you know, I don't think anyone thinks that's a good thing. But it does raise this interesting question, right? If there's no chance that anyone's ever going to listen, what should we be teaching them? What should we be withholding from them? Really interesting. This notion of mutav, this very same phrase, has a really interesting application in the context of the time that we're in now, of the 3 weeks, in mourning the temple. In source number 7. Gemara begins. So whoever mourns for Jerusalem will merit to see its joy. Tanya Amar Bishmael ben Elisha, Yom Shachar Beit HaMikdash, Din hu shenigzor al atzmenu shelo be'echol basar v'lo lishtot yayin. Ela im gozrin gzer al hatzibur, ela im kein rov hatzibur yecholim la'amod ba. He says that from the day the temple was destroyed, really we have no right to eat meat or drink wine. We should forbid meat and wine from consumption for the Jewish people. But, and this is a related concept, but it's impossible, it's forbidden to enact a decree on the community unless the majority of the community will abide by it. And he says, I know if we say you can't eat meat, that no one's going to listen. It's hard enough for the 9 days coming up. In the camp, I think they make a siyum on 8 of the 9 days. So maybe not 8 of the 9 days, but they make many siyumim and there's many barbecues, so that everyone can get their fill of meat. ומיום שפשטה מלכות הרשעה שגוזרת עלינו גזירות רעות וקשות מבטלת ממנו תורה ומצוות ואם מנחת אותנו להיכנס לשבוע הבן ואמרי לישוע הבן דין הוא שנגזור על עצמנו שלא לישא אישה ולהוליד בנים נמצא זר של אברהם אבינו קלה מאליו. Right, and he says it also makes sense, or the strict rule is, since there is this evil government in place that does not allow Jews to marry each other, and if they do marry, does not allow the children to be circumcised. So it makes sense that we should forbid marriage, because we can't fulfill the halachot that marriage requires. Ella hanachlam Yisrael mutav shishogagin v'alim azidin. Rather, and he evokes our principle, leave the Jewish people alone. It's better that they be unintentional sinners than intentional sinners, and therefore let's not publicize this, what this halacha really should be, but let people continue to marry and raise families, and they'll deal with the consequences as they deal with the consequences. So it's a really interesting Gemara, especially in this time of the year. It again raises the really interesting question of should we be hiding information? Should we be sharing information? We're not going to get through all of our sources inside, but I think that some of these might be at least conceptually familiar. So I just wanted to kind of highlight them, and feel free to look at the sources in more detail on your own. But another area in which this question really gets highlighted is the whole question of codification of halacha. And this begins with the Rambam, right? On Tisha B'Av, we mourn not only the burning of the Rambam's books by his enemies, but even worse, the burning of the Rambam's books by fellow Jews. Why did Jews burn the Rambam and ban the Rambam? And what was so horrible about the Rambam is that he gave the first halachic guidebook, the first halachic code, in which he didn't quote sources, he didn't bring divergent opinions. He said, the Mishnah Torah, my halachic guidebook, is intended to replace all others. So all you need to study is the Torah Shebaal Peh, the written Torah, and my book, right? And many things. So with the idea that so people can spend their time studying philosophy and studying what's really important. But there are many who said that this was a horrible thing, and that this is against the entire ethos of what Torah and Halacha is all about, and to the point that there were those who burnt learned Jews, who burnt the Rambam's books and forbade people from learning it because he was so anathema to what Halacha and the Halachic system is all about. And this continues through the subsequent codes of Halacha, most notably the Shulchan Aruch, where the very notable rabbis who say that the Shulchan Aruch is a horrible work, that we should not be learning the Shulchan Aruch. First of all, it makes, it leads to unqualified rabbis, because anyone can just look up the bottom line and what we do without understanding how we got to the point of ruling as we do. And secondly, it undoes what the halachic process is supposed to be. So the most vocal opponent was Shlomo Luria, we have in source number 12, but many others who also were vehemently opposed to the Shulchan Aruch and any other codes of halacha. Robert, certainly there are those who oppose Art Scroll and the entire phenomenon of the guidebooks that Art Scroll is at the forefront of. In just one more area where this idea of transparency is expressed, I'm sure we could think of others, but one more that I brought is in the debate over Ta'amei HaMitzvot, over the rationale of the mitzvot. Right? Are we supposed to understand why we have the mitzvot and why we do the mitzvot? So let's look at a couple of these sources inside. The Mishnah in Brachot, in source number 15. Again, we're going to not be able to get the Hebrew and the English on the same page. So the Mishnah is talking about various practices that people would have as they were davening. Ha'omer al kansi ko yagiu rachamecha, v'al tov yizachar shmecha, modim mashtikin oto. So if someone is davening and they say either, God, your mercy should extend to the nest of a bird, or your name should be mentioned with the good, or if they say modim, they say thank you twice, thank you, we silence him. Gemara says, Bishlama modim mashtikin oto mishum demefse kishtei rishiyot. Person says modim, they say thank you twice. It appears as if they're saying thank you to two different entities, two different gods. So that makes sense. The altov yizachar shmecha nami mashma ala tova v'lo ala ra'a. And if we say your name, God, should be associated and mentioned with the good, so that implies that God is only responsible for the good in the world and not the bad in the world. So that also makes sense. Ella. But when it comes to that first phrase in the Mishnah, Al kansi por yagiu rachamecha, my taima, what's the reason that we can't say that God's mercy should extend to the bird's nest. Kligi ba trei amori b'marava. Rabbi Yossi bar Avin, Rabbi Yossi bar Zvidna. So we have two Rabbi Yossis who argue about this. Chad amar shamitio kina b'masa breishi. So one says because you're going to make the animals jealous of each other. If you only mention the bird in your davening and not the lion and the dog and the cat and the tiger and the bear, the animals will be jealous of each other.
Anthropomorphic.
Yeah.
But you have that in Borki Nafshi and other things referring to how even the animals recognize what's going on. The lions roaring in order to.
Right. So I don't think he's saying don't learn from nature and don't evoke the images of nature, but specifically, you're only asking for God's mercy on the bird. Why you not the lion's going to be upset that he's not also getting God's mercy.
This is metonymy. You take the bird represents much more. So you like birds. You mentioned them.
Right.
You like the
Cats.
big cats. Other people might like the 17-year locusts.
I think this is a reference to the special mitzvah about bird's nests.
Right. So and then we're going to get there right now. So the other Rabbi Yossi, we don't know which one it is, says, if we say that God's mercy should extend to the bird's nest, well, we know there's a mitzvah of shiluach hakan, and so therefore you're saying that I understand why we have this mitzvah of shiluach hakan, of sending away the mother bird before taking the eggs, and that is improper because it shows, if you say that, it implies that you understand why we have the mitzvot, and really the mitzvot are gzerot hamelech. They're God's decrees. We do them because God tells us to do them and for no other reason. And so that would seem to be, if we accept that opinion of that Rabbi Yossi, would seem to be on the side that we don't need transparency. That we don't need to understand what we do or why we do it. We simply have to blindly follow and obey, and that is the preferred religious posture that he's advocating. And this is, this is not unique to him. There are many throughout history who have taken this very approach, said that no, we can't advocate for Tamei HaMitzvot. We can't try to explain the mitzvot. We shouldn't do the mitzvot because we think we know why we're doing them. We do them only because God told us to do them. And we have a few other sources with that as well. But so just to recap what we did, we saw a really provocative comment of the Ramban in the opening of our Parsha. Our Parsha begins with Moshe addressing the Roshei HaMatot, the heads of the tribes, and not addressing the laws of vows to the entire nation. The Ramban says this is because it's preferred that the entire nation not know about nullification of vows because they'll lead them to treat vows lightly. So that led us into our whole discussion about whether transparency is a value in halacha or not. I think we've seen sources on both sides of the argument. There are certainly those that say we want to be transparent and we want to have a full understanding of what we do and why we do it. And there are sources that indicate that no, transparency not only is not necessarily a value, but sometimes is the opposite of a value, right? That we strive or we don't want to have transparency or full understanding, either because people can't follow and know what they're supposed to do, and so it's better that they remain ignorant and on a level of shogeg, of unintentional sinners rather than intentional sinners, or because of the more religious posture that we want to only do what God tells us to do as following the king's decree and not for any other personal reasons or any other personal benefit that we may gain from it. Anyone have any questions or thoughts on this? We're quickly coming to the end of our hour, but happy to hear a few comments.
It raises the issue of paternalism, doesn't it? Presumably, if a parent of a 12-year-old girl hears her say a vow, I'm not going to eat any more such and such.
Right.
And he knows that she's got to have a certain amount of protein a day, or, you know, whatever it might be, because he knows the implications of what happens when a person doesn't have protein.
Right.
And she may not know that.
Right.
So it implies that it is important for someone who cares for someone else, who has perhaps more knowledge of the implications of something, have some say in the matter. And it also raises that question in regard to marriage, which for us these days seems rather strange, that he should have the power over her and she not have it over him.
Right.
Because he could also be doing something, the implications of which he may not realize, for the well-being of all of the children in the household, which she may have a better feeling for than he does if he's not there all the time, or vice versa for either side, you know. But
Different times.
it's a wrestling with responsibility. Who's responsible for whom and in what way too at the same time. So it's really a tough issue.
Yeah.
When they are living in a culture where the women themselves didn't necessarily know how to read at all. You said earlier, well, somebody said, yeah, people are literate. Were the women literate at that time? There's lots of examples of things people that they were not literate, and they were expected to not have the knowledge of the outside world to the extent that the men did, and so on. You know, it's really, to me, it just raises again the question of how much do we really care for one another? How well do any of us see the bigger picture of the implications of each other's actions, you know, things like that. That's what I'd like to have as a takeaway from it too, rather than get embroiled in the power struggles part of it, because there is, I mean, there's all kinds of power struggles contained here.
Right.
As Gary pointed out, who knows what really underlies this. Some people would say, well, yeah, they have to restrain the women because they have a spiritual sensitivity and they'll refuse this to them and take this on themselves and so on. I mean, there are those who think, both men and women, and certainly in this by Midbar, you can see it. How did they wind up in that mess with the Moabite women, which somebody was talking to me about the other day? Well, if they're on the verge of entering into struggling with the materiality of Canaan, they think that they have the power to make something holy just by their words.
Yeah.
They overestimate their capacity for holiness, which is what happened supposedly with Chava and Adam. They thought they thought they were invulnerable to such and such, you know, these things. I mean, these are the issues underlying this. I mean, it's just, I'm glad you brought it up, but it sure is not easy to come up with just one answer. I guess one thing is a certain humility and not realizing the implications of what we say.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yes, Beatrice, I can put the link again in the chat.
Rabbi Shapiro, Rabbi Chaim Shapiro, is one of the great rabbis in Baltimore. And he comes from Poland or Lithuania. And the book that he wrote, Poland, yeah, is Once Upon a Shtetl. And it's one of the Art Stroh history series. And it's a treasure. And I know I met him many times, and his wife was wonderful too.
Okay. All right, we are at 9 o'clock. So if anyone wants the last word, or else we'll say Laila Tov and see everybody next week, where we start Sefer Devarim.
Thank you.
All right.
Mr. Clark, thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, have a good night, everybody.
Erev Tov.
Erev Tov.